Wonderful. Well, good evening, guys. Really great to see you all here. Welcome to final event of the search. My name is Josh, and I'm from England.
I'm Yvonne. I'm from Nazareth. I'm a student here at the university. Before we start, أي حدا بحاجة للترجمة في أذنيات هون روح على اليمين. يرفع إيده. مشوا ترى ترجم يشرح.
Great. The search has been a week of events to help students explore the big questions of life, God, religion, faith, things we maybe think about at night, and hosted by a group called the Fellowship of Christian Students in Israel. We are a group of students made up of different groups speaking Hebrew, speaking Arabic, speaking English, who basically we love to facilitate events like this, to make a place where students can ask their big questions and everything is completely open. So yeah, we're very happy to see you here.
So today again we have Michael. She would like to come up here. Michael is a traveling speaker and an author. We learned these days that he's been to every country in Europe and that Tel Aviv is his favorite campus. So, what's your favorite thing about Tel Aviv?
Favorite thing about being in Tel Aviv? So it's hard not because there isn't any favorite things, but I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say, as a British person, I have enjoyed the weather. We have had the coldest, wettest spring on records back in Britain, so I just love the sunshine, which is great. In fact, I'm staying just a couple of blocks back from the beach, so this is the first time I've spoken at a week of events in the university, and I've got to sit on the beach in the mornings and go for a swim. So I've loved the weather and the beach and the water. I've loved your campus, as I said yesterday. I think it's very beautiful. And if I was able to study, I think I'd love to study here, sitting under a palm tree, reading some philosophical textbook. But I've also really loved getting to know a few of you through this week. When I say a few of you, it's not that I haven't loved getting to know the others of you. It's just like I haven't got to know all of you. But I've loved the conversations and the chats that we've had also out on campus. And I felt really welcomed. We are a very introverted culture in Britain. And so I love coming to a culture where people are just a lot more expressive and welcoming. So I felt very at home.
Wonderful.
Okay. Since we are diving into a more serious topic, we wanted to ask you a light-hearted question. Do you have any embarrassing moments you would like to share?
Well, yes, I have embarrassing moments. Do I want to share them with you? I don't know. I'll tell you this one. I don't know whether this is embarrassing for me or for my mother. When I was about 7 years old, maybe, we lived quite close to our local church. And one particular Saturday, in England, weddings generally happen on Saturdays. There was a wedding and my mum was quite busy. And so she said to me, could you go to take a photograph of the couple when they come out of the church? So I go down, dressed in my shorts, my t-shirt, my mum's little camera. And I wait and they don't come out of the church for a long time. And then I realized I've come too late. They've already left the church. So I found someone, I said, do you know what's happened to the bride and groom? And they said, oh, they've gone to the church hall for the reception, big meal. Now at this point, I probably should have gone home, given what I was wearing, and also that I wasn't invited to the meal. But I hadn't realized the kind of protocol of how weddings work. And so I then walked to the hall where they were having the big meal, and they were just in the middle of the big meal, and I walked straight through all of the guests in their suits and dresses. I walked straight to the top table where the bride and groom were, and then I announced to them, my mother has sent me to take a photograph of you. So then they very obligingly stopped and I took a photograph. And then I noticed there was the wedding cake. And I had been to a wedding of my aunt and uncle the year before. And I knew that the photograph that everyone liked to take was when the couple cuts the wedding cake. And so then I said to them, do you think you could go and cut the cake? I think my mother would like that picture as well. And so they got up and they went to cut the wedding cake just for me. And I took the picture. But this is so long ago, this is before digital cameras. So when I got home, my mum just said, "Did you get the pictures?" I said, "Yes," I gave her the camera. Didn't hear anything more about it for about 2 months until she got the film developed from the camera. And then I came home from school one day and she was not happy and she realized quite what I'd done. So the irony of all of that is that later in life, I did start officially taking wedding photographs for a few years. So, but when I did, I tended to dress a bit smarter.
Wonderful. Well, just before we hand over to you, just want to say that at the end of this talk, there is going to be a time for Q&A. We use the Slido website. You can access that right now by scanning this QR code, which is going to appear a couple of times through the talk also. So if you've got questions through the talk, you're very welcome to submit them anonymously. There will also be the opportunity to raise a hand at the end. And of course, there'll be plenty of time afterwards to enjoy some more food, take some free books. So don't feel any need to rush away or anything. We'd love to speak with you. But with that said, Michael, it's
great, thank you. It has been great being here this week. And if you're here for the first time, then an especially warm welcome to you. You have missed out, but you've not missed out completely. We're really glad that you're here. And this is the last event. Oh, I thought you were going to be sad about that. This is the last event. Oh, thank you. This is the last event, but it's not the end. We'll tell you at the end. There are ways that we hope that you'll continue to engage with this. And so if you're new to what FCSI put on, they will let you know about stuff that's going to be happening off the back of this. Now, we've been out on campus encouraging people to think about these big questions of life. And today we've been thinking about this topic of hope in relation to tonight's talk. We were asking people, what is the hope for the world? We got a fairly kind of even mix between science, self-discovery and God. Not a lot of hope in politics, which perhaps is unsurprising. But that was interesting. And then we also looked at the issue of humanity. We asked people, do you think humanity is part of the problem with the world and part of the solution? And again, a fairly even mix between those who were rather pessimistic about human nature and those who were more optimistic. But actually, probably the majority sense that to a degree, perhaps we are both, which we'll come back to later. So they were interesting surveys to do. And as we said, we want to hear your questions tonight. So this QR code up there will give you the opportunity to ask those questions. And as we've said on other nights, please don't feel at all inhibited. Please feel free to ask whatever questions you like. Can't guarantee that we'll be able to answer them all, but we will do the most popular ones. So you can be the arbiters of which questions get asked rather than me or anyone else. Okay? Now, I was reading recently about the story, happened a number of years ago, of a submarine, real true story, of a submarine just off the coast of the US. And it came to the surface, it was a naval submarine, just at the same time as another vessel was crossing its path. And so the two vessels collided, the submarine sank to the bottom of the ocean. And then divers were sent down to see if anyone had survived the accident. And when they got down to the wreckage of this submarine, they could hear this sound, this tapping sound coming from inside the hull. And then when they listened more carefully, they realized that it was not just any tapping sound, it was Morse code, it was a message. And the message was just very simple, and it was being repeated over and over again. And it simply said, is there any hope? Is there any hope? And I think that's a really good question to ask, actually, for us about our world, isn't it? Is there any hope for our world? As we look at the conflicts around our world, is there any hope? As we think about the climate crisis, is there any hope? Maybe as we think about our own circumstances and our own future, we might ask that question too. Is there any hope? And I get the impression, around Europe at least, in my travels, that in Europe people often think that there is a lack of hope. People seem to be less hopeful about the future. In fact, surveys and statistics would back that up. it would seem that an optimism that people had, particularly pre-COVID, has been dashed, perhaps by COVID and the war in Ukraine and so on. In fact, funny story, a couple of years ago, I was reading this book, fascinating book by Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli writer and historian. His first book, Homo Sapiens, which I mentioned 2 nights ago, looks at the history of humanity. Homo Deus was his kind of prediction about the future of humanity and where things might go. And in the introduction, it said this, he says this, he says, in the past, humanity has had 3 great enemies: war, famine, and plague. But then he says, because of the advancements of science and technology, we no longer need to fear the impact of war, famine, and plague. The irony of all of this was that I was listening to this as an audiobook whilst we were in lockdown, because the whole world was struck by a plague. And this was a year or 2 before the war of Ukraine was about to engulf continents of Europe again in a way that no one expected. And one of the implications of that, for some parts of the world, has been famine. So perhaps that unfounded optimism that we have in the possibility of technology to sort out all of our problems has been at least questioned, if not dented, by the reality of what we've been through. But is there hope for this world? In a sense, the way we answer that question kind of depends on your belief system, your view of ultimate reality. Some people will say, well, ultimately, we have come from nothing, we are heading to nothing. Life is a small blip and death is the end. There is no spiritual dimension to life, and there's certainly no God and no afterlife. And of course, on the ultimate kind of level, if that is true, then there is no ultimate hope for this world, is there? Bertrand Russell was a famous atheist of the 20th century. And he put it this way, he said, no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. And then he concludes, only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, and the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Cheerful chap, you might think. But actually, very consistent with his worldview. He says, ultimately, despair is what you have to build your life on. That's where life is heading, death. There is no hope for us, there's no hope for this world, and that's where we're going. And I guess that's why, perhaps, if we think deeply about this, we don't like that verdict about the world, which is perhaps one of the reasons, like we said the other day, that people explore spiritual questions and spiritual answers. And could it be that this life is not all there is? And certainly many world religions offer some hope that this world isn't all there is, and this life is not all there is. But again, if we go back to the question, is there a future for our broken worlds? In a sense, the answer that many religions would give to that question is still no. There might be hope, but actually the hope is of some other kind of world or some other kind of dimension. It's not for this world. And so salvation in many religious systems involves leaving this broken world to go to paradise or whatever we want to call it, but it's a departure from this world. And that is why I'd also want to say that the vision of the future that we find described within the Bible is different, and we'll think about this later, to other religious systems, and that actually it talks about a hope for this world. It doesn't talk so much about salvation as leaving this world and going off to heaven, but it talks about the renewal and transformation of this world. And if that is true, then obviously that is wonderful, not just for me, but for everything. But it does leave us a question, and that is, how do we know the answer to this question? How do we know whether there is more to this life and to this world? Are we left simply to guess? Can we know with any more certainty? A while back, I was in South Africa and I visited this place. It's called Cape Point. It's the most westerly point of the African continent. And up until about 500 years ago, no one from the European continent had ever been beyond this place. Many people had tried, but at this point where two oceans meet, you get treacherous currents and often unpredictable weather. And so many people had died trying to get beyond Cape Point. And then a Portuguese sailor called Vasco da Gama set off from Portugal. And he did what no one else had at that point done. He sailed beyond Cape Point. He sails right round to India and back again. And as a result of what he did, they changed its name. It used to be known as the Cape of Storms. You'll probably now know it as the Cape of Good Hope. Because one person had been beyond this point and had come back from the other side and can tell us what lay beyond. And as a result, they said that this was a place of hope. Now, I want to suggest tonight that, in a sense, that is a picture of ultimately the heart of the claim that Christians would make about Jesus. And that is that there is one person in all of history who has gone beyond the point of death, as it were, and come back from the other side and can say that actually there is hope. And if the claim of Jesus' resurrection is true, that would set Jesus apart as unique in all religious leaders who've ever lived through history. But of course, that raises a big question, like, how do we know whether it's true? I was talking to someone a while back, and we're talking about the resurrection. And she says, well, I can't believe in the resurrection. I'm a medical doctor, and I know that dead people stay dead. And I was kind of tempted to say, I am not a medical doctor, but I also know that dead people stay dead. I mean, like, you don't need to do 7 years at medical school to establish that kind of fact. And I'd even want to suggest that 2,000 years ago, that was also fairly common knowledge. So the idea that people started believing in resurrection simply because they were more primitive and lacked the understanding that we have today is, I think, perhaps a bit naive. But can we really take this claim seriously? Can we take it out of the kind of nice ideas and religious stories category and put it into the category of real history? And I actually want to suggest that we can. And what may surprise us tonight is that even among scholars who are not Christian believers, atheist and Jewish scholars as well, there's a general assumption about certain events, certain facts that history points towards in relation to this claim. And let's look at them. 5 pieces of evidence that almost all scholars would agree upon. And the first is this, that Jesus was crucified. Okay? One scholar said it's one of the most certain facts of antiquity that we can be sure about. It's not only documented within the New Testament documents, the biographical accounts of Jesus' life, but it's also documented externally to the Bible as well. Jesus' death under the governorship of Pontius Pilate 2,000 years ago, not too far from here. I'm kind of used to, in England, always saying 2,000 miles away. So it's really nice being able to say just up the road, okay? It happens, and people know that that is one fact that we can hold on to. The second is this, that Jesus' tomb was discovered to be empty. No one doubted this claim for at least 200 years. That's the first time that someone claims otherwise. And certainly the Christian movement couldn't really have begun to spread if the tomb hadn't been empty, because it was based on this claim of resurrection. And it would have been very easy to debunk the whole thing if the tomb still had a body rotting inside of it. Interestingly as well, all of the biographical accounts record that the first witnesses of this event were women. Now, what's important to remember is that at that point and in that culture, a woman would not have been regarded as a reliable witness in a court of law. So it's an interesting fact that if you were to invent a story and you were making the most stupendous claim, why would you make the witnesses of that claim people who in your culture were not regarded as reliable witnesses, unless, of course, the facts it happened and they were? The third fact is this: the disciples were convinced that they had met Jesus risen from the dead. Something convinced them. And we know that because all of them were willing to suffer, and most of them were willing to die for this conviction that they now had. Now, it is true, isn't it, that sometimes people die for things that aren't true. But it's not the case that people die for things that they know aren't true. It's a different category. And if the followers of Jesus had simply invented this story, they would have, of course, known it wasn't true. And the fact they were willing to suffer and die for it would lead us to think that they themselves were convinced. I often say, sorry?
Can I see something?
Can we go to questions at the end? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but write it down. We're definitely happy to have questions at the end. But yeah. Now, what I was going to say on that is when I was a child, I used to make up stories to get myself out of trouble. Okay, so I would say things like, you know, the dog ate it, or my sister did it, or it was on fire when I arrived. Those kind of stories. I didn't generally make up stories to get myself into trouble. Okay, so again, it's an interesting factor. The disciples seem to be convinced by that. Fourthly, the lives of Jesus' followers were transformed by this belief in the resurrection. Not simply those who had previously followed Jesus, but also people who hadn't followed Jesus. So people like James, Jesus' half-brother, or Saul, who became known as Paul, someone who had persecuted the early Christian movements until an encounter with Jesus seemed to transform his outlook. And then fifthly, the explosion of the Christian movements in the first century. So the Roman historian Tacitus talks about how within 20 years, Christians had become so populous in the city of Rome that Nero was able to falsely accuse them for the fire that he most probably started himself. But that shows that actually this movement spread very rapidly and very quickly based on this idea, this claim. So those are 5 pieces of evidence. The question, I guess, that we have to ask is this: what do we make of it? How do we explain it? And generally, there have only been a few explanations that people have given. And again, if you want to suggest others, stick them on the slide there or put your hand up at the end. We'll definitely take questions and comments on that. But generally, here are things that people say. Certainly in my conversation with my Muslim friends, their conviction would be this: that someone else died on the cross. So it wasn't resurrection, it was someone else who died, not Jesus. Therefore, Jesus wasn't dead, therefore it wasn't resurrection, and so on. And that's a commonly held assumption, certainly among my Muslim friends. I guess my question about that would be, if that was the case, why do we have no contemporary sources? And why is it not until several hundred years later that we find this claim being made? Not at the time. And why, therefore, should I take sources written several hundred years later as more reliable than the ones that were documented at the time? Secondly, some people would say, well, maybe Jesus didn't die. Maybe he kind of passed out on the cross. Maybe people mistook his coma for death. Maybe he revived in the tomb, and therefore it wasn't so much resurrection, but it was resuscitation that was happening in that instance. There's a couple of things worth saying, and there's no instance of anyone surviving crucifixion as far as we know. And it would seem that the Romans were quite good at doing it. They did it quite a lot. Jesus is not the only victim. There is one instance where someone was taken down off the cross because someone intervened on their behalf, but even then they died of their wounds later on because the wounds were so horrific. Interestingly, one of the eyewitness accounts talks about how after Jesus had died, a spear was thrust into his side and what looked like blood and water flowed out, which they wouldn't have known at the time, but we now know would be medical proof of death occurring. But also, if this had happened and Jesus wasn't really dead, what you'd have to imagine is that Jesus is taken off the cross, no one notices that he's still alive. He's wrapped in lots and lots of burial cloth. He's placed in a tomb. The stone is placed across the entrance. A guard of Roman soldiers is placed outside. And then at some point over the next 3 days, Jesus wakes up and then he unravels himself from all the burial cloths, and then he ravels it all up again, and then he pushes away the stone, and then he runs past the Roman guards, and then he grabs some clothes from some passerby, and then he manages to appear in a locked room, and he convinces his disciples that actually he is the Lord of history who's conquered death, and not actually a very, very sick man who desperately needs to get some medical treatment as quickly as possible. It does seem a little bit far-fetched when we start to imagine what would have happened to have happened. Third option is this: the women went to the wrong tomb. Someone once said to me, well, they're women and they're bad at directions. And I'm like, seriously, are you suggesting that? By the way, my wife, as I mentioned, she's an airline pilot. She is much better at directions than I am. Just before you think that I'm making any sexist claims. And actually, if you read the accounts, it's not just the women who went to find the tomb. Actually, after that, the men also went to the tombs. There were repeated visits, not just one. And if you've ever had to bury someone, you don't normally forget where you bury them. But again, if they had, for some reason, you've got to bear in mind two things. Firstly, you've still got to account for the supposed appearances of Jesus, separate claim. But also, kind of imagine the situation. A few weeks later, you've got Peter standing up in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Tomorrow. Pentecost. Tomorrow, is it tomorrow? Yeah. Saturday, sorry. But like coming up. So like, it's day of Pentecost, he's in Jerusalem, and he announces to the crowds, Jesus was crucified, but he's alive, and his tomb is empty. And then someone from the back of the crowd would have been like, excuse me, Peter, I think you might have gone to the wrong tomb. I think that's actually Uncle John's tomb, and Jesus' tomb is down that road. And everyone would have run down, checked out the tomb, Jesus' body's still there, Christians would have looked a complete load of idiots, the whole thing would have stopped. Option number 4 is that the body was moved. Again, this wouldn't account for the appearances of Jesus, but it would potentially account for the empty tomb. But again, you have to ask the question, who? Would it have been the authorities? Well, they would have been in a position to do so, but if they had done so, why didn't they produce the body when people started claiming that Jesus was alive? Second option would be grave robbers, perhaps. But again, if it was grave robbers, what motivation would they have for trying to break into a guarded tomb to steal the body of a penniless preacher? And why did they stop to take all the grave clothes off in the process and so on? The most obvious culprits would be the disciples, the followers of Jesus, and that was the story that was initially spread by those who were opposed to this idea. But again, as we said earlier, it would seem that the followers of Jesus were absolutely convinced that they had encountered Jesus and that he was alive, and were willing to die for that belief. And of course, if they had stolen the body, they would have known that his body was still rotting in someone's attic, and he wasn't alive. And would they have been willing to hold on to that lie, even when it was costly? Another option is this: the disciples were hallucinating. Now, this wouldn't account for the empty tomb, but it would account, wouldn't it, for the experiences of supposedly encountering a risen Jesus. I've got a friend who was professor of psychiatry at the University of Bristol, and I was speaking to him once, and I said, would hallucinations account for the supposed appearances of Jesus that we read about? And he said the thing about hallucinations is that they normally happen to individuals rather than groups. They normally happen for very long periods of time, and they can go on and on. And thirdly, they normally happen at the periphery of our perceptions. You see a face in a crowd, or you hear a voice in a noisy environment. And they normally have a negative impact upon our mental well-being. He said the appearances of Jesus don't fit that, because it didn't just happen to individuals, it happened to groups. It happened for a set period of time with no repetition. And it wasn't just at the periphery of their perception. These people thought they had literally talked with him, touched him, ate with him, and so on. And instead of having a negative impact on their mental well-being, it turned them into courageous people who were willing to confront the Roman authorities of their day and take this message across the Roman world. So that doesn't seem to fit with hallucinations. The other option, of course, is this: that potentially Jesus actually rose from the dead. And as incredible as that claim seems, when we initially come across it, my contention is this: that when we start to look into the evidence, and the more we look into the evidence, the more compelling it would seem. I mentioned the University of Bristol. I had a friend who was a student there a few years ago. And at Easter time, a few years ago, they put on a special event, the Christian student group, like the one that are putting on this event. And they called it the Great Resurrection Debates. And they advertised it in the student newspaper. And they basically gave people the 5 pieces of evidence that we looked at a moment before. And they invited people to come up with an explanation for the evidence like we've looked at tonight. How would you explain this evidence? So they gave some more further reading that you could do and so on. And then they said that they were basically to write a 500 words piece. They would shortlist the best entrants, and then the best entrants would get to deliver their presentation to a meeting of the students at the heart of the university. And then a high court judge, not a Christian believer, would adjudicate which one was the best response, and then they would get £500, which is about 2,500 shekels. And this was a few years ago. So like even today, that's not a bad amount to win, is it? So anyway, the event happens, and different people presented their cases. The High Court judge awarded his prize to the one he thought was best, which was basically a version of this second option, that Jesus didn't really die and somehow resuscitated on the cross. But a few interesting things happened. Firstly, the guy who accepted the awards and won it basically said at the end that he wasn't really that convinced by his own arguments, but he was really glad for the £500. Thank you very much. Secondly, the High Court judge, not a Christian believer, who was adjudicating the awards, in his closing remarks basically said none of the cases that have been made really stand up in a court of law, because none of them really accounted for the evidence or explained it away in the way that essentially the resurrection could. The third interesting thing that happened was actually a few weeks later, and that is the guy who won the £500 actually became a follower of Jesus himself, because he actually became convinced that the best explanation for the evidence was indeed the resurrection. Now, I'm guessing that in a room like this, there may be some of us who are already convinced of that. There may be some of us who aren't convinced of that yet. But even if we're not, my appeal would be to, at the very least, to investigate it and to work out for yourself what you make of the evidence and the alternative explanations. But the last question before we finish is this. What is the implication of this? Why have we just spent 15 minutes looking at the evidence for ahistorical events? Because I think it relates massively to this question. Is there hope for this world? I want to suggest, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then actually the answer to that question is yes, there is. And I just want to say 3 things briefly. If Jesus rose from the dead, firstly, there is hope for justice for our world. A few years after the event of Jesus' resurrection, one of those followers who I mentioned, the Apostle Paul, was in the city of Athens in Greece, and he was talking about this message to a group of philosophical thinkers. And at the end of his address in the Areopagus in Athens, he says this: God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed, and he's given proof of it to everyone by raising him from the dead. In other words, he says there is a day when there will be justice done in our world, and the one who will do that judging and bring that justice is the same one who rose from the dead. The claim is that Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the end, and there is justice to come. And in a sense, that's really good, isn't it? Sometimes people don't like the idea of God judging the world. But certainly if you've ever experienced horrific evil and injustice, then that maybe is a more attractive proposition. I was talking to a friend of mine who comes from North Korea, who escaped twice, was nearly killed by the North Korean regime. And for him, as a Christian believer, the idea that there is a God who will one day bring justice to our world is a very, very attractive proposition. But it's also quite a sobering proposition, isn't it? Because if there is a God who will bring justice to the world, what about us? What about the stuff in our lives? A few years ago, I was traveling by plane from England to Scotland. It wasn't a long flight. I was only taking hand luggage. But I got to the airport, so I was going through security at the airport. You put your bag on the scanner, and I went through to the other side. And I was waiting for my bag to come through, but it didn't come through. And so eventually, when it did come through, this lady came over and she said, "We're going to have to search your bag." So I said, "That's fine." I was expecting, just for her to kind of look in the top and say, "That's fine." But no, she took every item out of my bag and she placed it on this large table. The first thing out of my bag was my Bible. So I was tempted to feel a bit kind of self-righteous as that went on the table. And then she took out some notebooks and different things. And then I kind of got about halfway, she got about halfway down my bag, and I suddenly realized, there are things in my bag that go in and they never come out. It's like a kind of black hole. And as I'm thinking this, she pulls out this banana peel that's been in there for several weeks, and she places it on the table. And then there's like an apple core that goes on the table. And then there's a packet of sandwiches from last week that goes on the table. And like all the time, people are walking past and they're just looking at all of these things and they're laughing. And I'm just standing there thinking, this is so embarrassing. Eventually, she finds the screwdriver, which was the reason why I'd been searched in the first place, which she actually let me keep. And at the end, she said, "I'll let you pack your own bag," which obviously meant that she didn't want to touch the banana peel more than once. And as I was throwing most of it into the nearest bin, I was kind of thinking to myself, that was really embarrassing. But imagine if that kind of happens metaphorically with my life. Imagine if all the things that I've ever done and said and thought were put out on display tonight on this platform up here. How would I feel? Now, I think there'll be some things I would be really proud of. And rightly so. I think there'll be things that we're all proud of in life. But I tell you what, there'd be other things that we'd be utterly ashamed of, wouldn't we? We asked people this afternoon, is humanity the problem or the solution? And the reality is sometimes we can do wonderful things that make the world better. But the very same people, including us, can also do things that make the world worse. And if there is a day of ultimate justice, what does that mean for us? And that's why I want to suggest the second thing about the resurrection is this. Firstly, the resurrection means that there is hope for justice for our world. But secondly, there's hope for forgiveness for our world. Because at the heart of the claim that Jesus makes is this, that through his death that we thought about, it is possible for us to be forgiven. That God accepts us not on the basis of us being good enough, or religious enough, or moral enough, because none of us could ever be enough, but on the basis of his free forgiveness through his death. But if Jesus had simply stayed dead, how would we know that that claim was some claim that we could base our lives on, and not just an empty claim? And I suggest the answer is the resurrection. It's like the receipt that you get that shows that your payment has been accepted rather than declined. It proves that it happens. And again, that's great news, because it means that I don't need to fear that day of justice if I know the one who's already taken what I deserve on my behalf. If Jesus was the one who took the ultimate judgment that I should face. And so I can look forward with confidence. So what does the resurrection mean? It means there's hope for justice. It means there's hope for forgiveness. And also I want to say there is hope for today. You might be saying, what has all this got to do with today? This is all pie in the sky when you die. This is all about the future. I want to know about this world now. Isn't this just, wishful thinking? And I want to make this claim. Those in history that have often made the biggest impact upon this world now have often been those who have had a hope beyond death. Because actually, I would suggest that the Christian hope of life beyond death gives you the greatest motivation to get involved in the world today. Because as we said at the beginning, the Christian hope is not leaving this world, departing to be a disembodied spirit, floating on a cloud, going to a choir practice, dressed in a nightie, and all of the other fluffy, ephemeral imagery that we have associated with life after death. The Christian vision based on the resurrection is resurrection. It is the restoration of this world. It is the restoration of these bodies. And if that is the case, that means that those who believe in that claim have the greatest reason to care about this world, because it's not heading towards destruction. Whether that's, the apocalypse, or whether that's simply some other kind of spiritual ending, it is heading towards renewal. And so I suggest people who follow Jesus should have the greatest motivation to care about this world today. And not just what we call the spiritual part of life, but all of life, including your studies, including the environment, including relationships. Everything matters if this story is true, because everything is heading towards redemption and restoration. Now, I've made a lot of big claims tonight. I don't know what you think of this. I'm sure we'll hear about that in a minute when we go to questions. It may be that you're still very skeptical. Maybe we're kind of almost programmed to be quite skeptical about particularly Christian claims and religious claims. Sometimes, perhaps because of that, we can miss potentially something of great magnitude because we get put off by the packaging. One of my funniest stories I ever read about from Tel Aviv was actually 14 years ago. I read it in the British press. Apparently, there was an old lady living in Tel Aviv who had her life savings stashed in her mattress in her bed. Okay, she basically didn't trust the banks. And she had the equivalent of $1 million stashed in life savings in cash in her mattress. The only problem is, her daughter decided that her mother needed a new bed. And so she threw away her mother's bed without asking, including the mattress. Apparently, when this story became known, there had to be security guards put on like the landfill sites around the city because people were trying to break in to see if they could find this $1 million. I never heard where they ever found it, actually. But she threw away something of incredible value because she didn't see the value that was in it. And I think so often people can throw away something of incredible value because they see the packaging of Christianity or the institution of the church, and they never check out what's really inside it. And I would say, although on the outside it might not look much, internally there is something of great value. So check it out, even if the first step, well, especially the first step might be just to look at one of those biographical accounts of Jesus' life, to read about it for yourself, to check it out, to look at the evidence. It might be you're intrigued, you're not skeptical, but you're intrigued and you're saying, I really want to find out more. Well, the good news is that you can. This QR code here takes you not to Slido, it takes you to a feedback form. And on this feedback form, you can basically get in contact so that we can stay in touch. I say we, it won't be me, it will be part of the group that's organised this event. And they'll let you know about stuff that's going to be happening that might be helpful to look into this more. We'd love to look into that more with you. But I'd also just want to say briefly, it may be that for some of us actually, we've heard these claims. It may be that we're even increasingly convinced that this might be true, but we might be kind of asking the question, how can I discover this for myself? Because this isn't just a truth fact from history, it can be a real experience that we can have. We can experience the forgiveness of Jesus. We can experience the hope that he can bring into our lives through that, and the relationship restored with God that can bring about. And that is offered to each one of us, but it has to be received. And actually, how do you receive it? Well, these are three of the very simple words, aren't they, that we say when we're kids, or we learn to say, sorry, thank you, please. And maybe they are words that are also good words to say to God. To say to God, sorry for stuff in our lives that are wrong, the stuff that separates us from him. To say thank you that through Jesus, there is the possibility of forgiveness for us. And then to say, please, God, will you come into my life? Will you give me this forgiveness and this hope and this transformation that we talk about? And actually, the reality is, if we say that honestly to God, then the claim is that God wants to give that to us and that we can discover that for ourselves. And that would be a brilliant way to respond to what we've heard. But I'm sure there are questions. So we might just take 1 minute So go on to Slido if you've not already. Put in your questions and have a look at the others and vote on them. As we said, you can also put up your hand as well as stick it on the Slido. And then our host will join us in 1 minute, and then we'll go back to the questions after that. Okay?
Cool. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Cool. Well, let's crack on with some questions. As we said, there's going to be time to put a hand up and receive questions from the floor. But by the looks of things, we've got a question with 12 votes, so let's just dive in with the top question here. Oh, okay. Got some chopping and changing.
Yeah, good to be out votes, but then it's still both on 12. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll read the one that's at the top now. What are the external sources outside the New Testament for the evidence of the crucifixion and the empty tomb? What title or status do these sources give Jesus?
So we're looking at sources outside of that. In terms of written sources, I mentioned obviously Tacitus, talking about the growth of Christianity and the claims there. Obviously, there's a quote from Josephus, although that has some dispute over exactly how much of the quote is legitimate and not, given that he clearly wasn't a Christian believer. And so some people would suggest that at least part of that quote isn't authentic. But even amongst the bits that are, we certainly see that Jesus lived. We see his death by crucifixion. We see that in spite of that, Christianity continues to spread and to grow. And we certainly see evidence of the rapid growth of Christianity and the conviction that it was based upon the fact that Jesus was alive. Now, clearly, lots of people didn't share that conviction that Jesus was alive. Although, interestingly, as we said, one of the suggestions is the disciples stole the body. That seems to be the earliest kind of secondary claim. But outside of that, there doesn't seem to be like this is the explanation. So we've got several things there. The other thing I would say, though, in terms of like external sources, is it's very easy to say, like, I'm only going to accept sources that are external to the New Testament documents, because they are reliable and unbiased, and the New Testament is unreliable and biased. There is obviously a mistake that you can make with the Bible, and that is to assume that it must be true simply because it's a religious text, and that would be a circular argument. But equally, it would be a circular argument just to assume that it isn't true because it's a religious text. We actually want to put it on the level of any other historical text to say, what are the reasons we have for taking this seriously? And in one sense, all texts come with bias, but we can take that into account and still use them. There is no such thing as a completely neutral text. And the other thing is worth saying is the New Testament isn't one source. It's actually a whole collection of sources, but that were later gathered together into a collection of books. And so we're not talking about one source here. We've got obviously the 4 biographical accounts of Jesus' life, but actually the letters in the New Testament written from Christians to early Christian communities are often earlier than the Gospels and contain some of the strongest claims about resurrection. So the book of 1 Corinthians 15 has a whole, the book of 1 Corinthians has a chapter 15, that's a whole chapter on this claim of resurrection. And it basically quotes from a tradition that goes back to within probably, scholars would suggest, 2 years of the events, talking about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So don't discount the New Testament. We've got to look at that. Don't assume it's necessarily true, don't assume it's necessarily false. Check it out like we would other sources too. Does anyone want to come back on that, or have we got a question from the floor before we go on to the next one? No? Okay.
Wonderful. Well, this next question, feel free to give as much time to as you want, because it sounds like this is a very important question, and perhaps these next two we can kind of consider together. But yeah, how can I have hope in this world through Jesus and trust him if he is the Almighty and can do anything, but he isn't stopping all the evil? So similarly, how can I not lose hope in difficult times?
Yeah, they're huge questions. In a sense, it's such a good question, it deserves a whole other talk. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a whole other talk. And therefore, what I can say now is actually just a starter, certainly not an exhaustive answer on this. How can I have hope in this world through Jesus and trust him? If he is almighty to do anything, but he isn't stopping all the evil. In one sense, what I would often say to people is, okay, God's almighty, so he can do anything, he can stop anything. What would you get God to stop? And it's not hard, is it, to maybe think of individuals or situations that God could intervene in and stop. But, of course, we could ask the question, if that was the case, would the world be a perfect place? Would we get rid of all suffering if that was the case? And of course, probably the answer is no. Because whilst it is true that terrorists and world leaders can cause great suffering through the decisions that they make, so can people very close to us. And if we're honest, so can us. Sometimes the greatest hurt in my life has been caused by people that weren't terrorists or world leaders, but family and friends. And I know that sometimes I have hurt others in that way. So if we want God, who is almighty, to get rid of all suffering in the world, one of the questions is, well, where does he stop? Now, he could, in theory, get rid of all suffering in the world, but of course, who would be left to live in the world? And in a sense, one of the things we find in the Bible is this claim that God has given us real responsibility and that there are consequences to our actions. And in one sense, that means that we have the capability of causing real hurt and harm to the world. But on the other hand, it means that we also have the capability of causing real help and really loving people. And love and choice go together, don't they? If there was no human autonomy and responsibility, it would be hard to talk about love as being a real thing. That's why, as we said, humanity is this complexity. In a sense, we can be part of the problem and part of the solution. So a great degree of suffering in the world is caused by people. Now, equally, when I say that, most of us might think, yes, but there is, of course, suffering in the world that isn't directly caused by people. We might talk about natural evil. You know, who do you blame for cancer, or for an earthquake, or for a tsunami, and so on? And clearly, it would be wrong to try and associate that always with, you know, a human action. Oh, this happened because of this, and so on. And often the Bible doesn't give us a complete answer to that question, other than to say that the world we live in as it is at the moment is neither the way it once was nor the way it one day will be. So the New Testament book of Romans makes this claim that creation, all of the cosmos, is groaning. It's broken. Somehow human rejection of God has had consequences for the very fabric of the world in which we live. So nothing is quite the way it should be. And although that's kind of bad news, in one sense, that at least makes sense of my emotions. So when I look at the world and I have the sense that things shouldn't be this way, the Bible story says, you're right, like it shouldn't. And I would have a bigger problem if I didn't believe the Bible story and if I just believed that I was here by chance, because why do I have such an emotional reaction against the injustice of our world? If this is just the way things are, why do I long for a world that is so much different to the world we live in if this is the only one we've ever known and the only one we'll ever have? So I would suggest even our sense of brokenness of the world points us towards both our longing for hope, which the Christian story talks about, and the reality of brokenness that we experience now, which the Christian story also talks about. And being a follower of Jesus certainly doesn't guarantee life now will be any easier. In fact, for some through history and in the world today, it can be harder. But I think it genuinely says that there is real hope and that hope can make a real difference. You know, we see that on a kind of very superficial level, don't we? You know, if I knew that tomorrow I was going to the dentist, sorry to all you dental students, I wouldn't be very happy. If I knew tomorrow I was going on holiday, I'd be a lot happier. Our knowledge of the future affects our current situation. And if it is true that the future for our world is resurrection, then that does change the way you experience life now in the light of that. And if it's not just a wishful imagination, but if it's actually based on something objective, then it's something we can really build our lives on. That's just a starter. There's lots more to be said, but yeah, big question.
Wonderful. Again, opportunity to put a hand up. So here we go. How can Christians claim to bring hope when they brought on some of the worst things? The Holocaust, Martin Luther supported it. Well, yes, and the Spanish Inquisition, etc.
Okay. How can Christians claim to bring hope when they brought on some of it? I think the first thing I would say is I'm not claiming that Christians are bringing this hope. I'm claiming that Jesus brings this hope, and there's a big difference between people who have claimed to follow Jesus through history very often and the Jesus who is at the heart of the whole story. And as I say, so often we can throw away the mattress of Christianity, not realizing the treasure of Jesus within. And the reality is that through history, Christians have often been responsible for holding views that we would find abhorrent. Clearly, Martin Luther 500 years ago wasn't supporting the Holocaust that happened in the future, But he certainly did hold views that were anti-Semitic and could have been used to justify that, which is awful. And I wouldn't want to defend that in any way. But in a sense, the question is, how do we judge anyone through history? We were talking about this a little bit, I think, yesterday. And we were saying, ultimately, the way you can judge Christianity is ultimately by the standard of Jesus Christ himself. So how do I judge the claims of Martin Luther or anyone else? I have to go back and say, well, how consistent or inconsistent were they with the Jesus that they claim to follow? To talk about not Martin Luther, but Martin Luther King. Mentioned him a couple of nights ago. Martin Luther King, standing against racism in the civil rights movements, would have confronted a lot of Christians in America who were basically incredibly racist and justified their racism as Christians. But the interesting thing is, what did Martin Luther King say to such people? Did he say, reject your Christianity, and in doing so, you will stop being so racist? Actually, he said, no, you need to be more Christian. You need to really understand what it is that you claim to follow. You need to be more consistent with Jesus. Or if you want another example, someone like William Wilberforce, who I mentioned 2 nights ago, who stood against the slave trade in the UK 200 years ago. There were Christians who would have been in support of the slave trades, but his answer or his challenge to them was not drop your Christianity so that we can abolish slavery. It was actually, no, be more consistent with the Jesus that you claim to follow. And so I would say, certainly there have been people through history who claim to follow Jesus, who certainly haven't brought hope to the world. But the answer is not to therefore reject Jesus, but actually to get back to try and consistently follow him. And none of us will do it perfectly. Because we are broken, fallen people, which is why my hope is not in the church or in a Christian, it is in Jesus. And there is a difference between those things. Great.
Again, we'll probably have time for a couple more questions. At some point, they're going to have to close the building, unfortunately. So do make sure you're voting so that we're not going to, since we won't get through all the questions, we want to make sure that the questions that are answered are those that shared. But
any more from the floor before we carry on? Any more comments or questions? You want to ask?
Yeah, I'm having this second class.
Okay, don't worry. It's fine. That's fine.
I don't think it's very important, but you make your point.
Okay.
Like one comment about the evidence, or one of the 5 evidence about the hope.
Okay.
Say, we said that all the messengers who believe in Jesus and that he came from there, they have been willing to die for his beliefs or his message. Let's say. So I have a very similar example, but stands for a very bad way, such as ISIS. They are willing to die and kill another innocent people in their behalf, in their case. So that doesn't make it that doesn't justify or make it a very better.
No, thanks for making the point, because it helps me to just kind of clarify. And it certainly is the case that people will die for other beliefs. I think my point was that generally when people die for their beliefs, they are convinced that their beliefs are true. That doesn't mean that they are true necessarily, but they are convinced personally that they are true and be willing to do that. And my point is that if the disciples had invented the story of resurrection, hadn't had some experience that had convinced them that Jesus was alive or that the tomb wasn't indeed empty, then they would have been propagating an idea that they would have known wasn't true. And the difference is therefore between someone dying for something they're convinced is true but might not be, and someone dying for something that they themselves actually is convinced isn't true. It was interesting, I was reading a book by a guy who was convicted in the Watergate scandal. And it's a fascinating book. He was convicted and then he basically imprisoned, became a Christian, and later on wrote quite extensively about this. And one of the things he said is that basically when the pressure is on, the truth normally comes out. So when people are making up stories, they will do that to an extent until it becomes costly, and then it starts to unravel. And he says that's one of the things that seems to be so compelling here, their ability and willingness to hold on to that claim when it was costly. So, but thanks for the points. Yeah.
Final chance to raise a hand. Give it a few seconds. Now I'm tempted to do something I haven't done all week, which is reject the top question. And I don't know what you think, Michael. I appreciate this first question. I'm not convinced that this is the time.
Okay, my answer to the first question is maybe talk about what I've talked about tonight. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So rewatch this lecture.
But I get your point.
And here we have. I think it's obvious that Jesus really existed, but I can't accept the resurrection. I just don't feel that it happened. What advice can you give me?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really intriguing question. And obviously, I guess one of the big differences between admitting that Jesus existed and believing the resurrection is that one involves perhaps a massive challenge to your preconceptions and worldview, right? It doesn't take any change to a secular atheistic worldview, perhaps, to say that Jesus existed. Although, interestingly, some atheists through history have tried to go even further and say, against all the evidence, that he didn't. Although, interestingly, no historian seems to want to do that. But to say that Jesus rose from the dead obviously does challenge your worldview, particularly, well, actually it challenges your worldview, whatever your worldview is. So it was a challenge to the first century followers of Jesus for their Jewish worldview. It was also a challenge for the non-Jewish people in the first century. And it would still be a challenge today, whatever your religious beliefs or none. I was chatting to a student just after a talk in England a few weeks ago, and he was like, man, this is big. If this is true, this changes everything. And I'm like, yeah, it does. And I guess that's why perhaps we find it a bigger stumbling block. Now, obviously, if your preconception is that there is no God and miracles are impossible, then resurrection is going to be a challenge to that belief system or that assumption. And so therefore, you're probably going to come to this with a degree of skepticism, which is fine. By the way, even though I am a Christian believer, I come to a lot of claims about miracles with a healthy degree of skepticism. I don't just assume that they happen because they're a claim of miracles. But I would say actually it's profoundly unscientific to reject evidence based on a prior assumption without investigating it. Because actually, if you think about many great discoveries in science, they've basically been, we have an assumption, we discover evidence that doesn't fit the assumption, therefore we have to change our view of reality in accordance with the evidence, rather than rejecting the evidence so that reality can fit in with our preconceptions. And so yes, this is going to be a big challenge, but my challenge to you would be, don't reject it simply because this is big. Actually look at the evidence. And to pick up on the word feel, I just don't feel it happens. Ultimately, the question is not, of course, do I feel it happen? The question is, did it happen? And feelings are not unimportant in life, are they? But they shouldn't be the ultimate arbiter and foundation, certainly of our belief system. When I was a follower of Jesus, when I was just starting out following Jesus, a friend once said to me, he says, the foundation of the Christian life is not feelings, it's facts. Did it happen? Check out the evidence. And they really encouraged me, whenever you get questions or doubts or uncertainties, actually ask the questions, investigate. If this is worth believing, it is worth believing not because we don't ask questions of it, but because we do, and it will stand up to them. And then they said, faith is actually putting your trust in what you're convinced is true. And again, that's an act of our will, not an act of our emotions, primarily. And then ultimately, our feelings do follow, but they are not the foundation. And I found that really helpful because feelings are an unhelpful guide for lots of things in life. Sometimes my feelings are connected to reality and correspond with reality, but sometimes they don't. And sometimes I have to challenge my feelings by evidence in all sorts of different areas of life. And I would suggest this is one too. And that's really helpful because sometimes I wake up in the morning and I don't feel great. I had a friend who had a lovely habit in life. Whenever he woke up in the morning and he didn't feel great, he just asked himself a question: did Jesus rise from the dead? And if the answer to that question is yes, he has reason to feel hopeful about the day and about life, even if his feelings subjectively at that moment in time are not corresponding with that. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, we do really have hope, and that is something we can build our life on. Guys, thank you so much for your questions. If, as I've said before, those answers have provoked other questions, you grab me, we'll be outside. We can talk over drinks and over snacks. I'd love to chat more. Do look at the bookstall and take away any of the accounts of Jesus' life in a selection of languages on the bookstall. Also, my book, Making Sense of Life, that looks at some of these big topics, including the topic of hope. And that's, again, free for you to take away on the bookstall. So do that. It's been a real joy being with you, Dave. I'm back, guys.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here for the last few nights. And again, I mean, us as people, we're not going to be leaving anytime soon, but we are going to have to get out of the building pretty soon, unfortunately. So we can take the food and books and things outside, but do make sure you take a look at that now. I'm going to put the QR code back on the screen in a second with a kind of response form. Actually, you can also get to that on the flyer, which is on social media as well. Please, please, please do get in touch. Let us know how you found these events, what you want to see in the future. As I said at the beginning, we have groups that meet in speaking English, Hebrew, Arabic. Groups of people who are convinced that this is true, that Jesus did live and die and rise again. And because of that, we believe it's worthwhile to spend time reading the Bible and applying it to our lives today. So if you're interested to kind of just take part in a relaxed social gathering where we do that, then absolutely everyone is welcome. You can bring your friends. If you're interested to maybe meet up with an individual rather than the FCSI, then that's also an option. You can make that happen. But please now, make the most of the books and the food. Come and talk to us. And thanks so much for being a part of this week.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think we can. I want to say it now. It's like really trusting people by all means. Like, you won't.
I think maybe play by people having together. It's just a beautiful business and all having